In today's video, I'd like to talk to you about some tips and tricks and some things to consider when you have an unplanned D&D session. What do I mean? So, you spent the hours, weeks, months leading up to the coming session. You've got a folder worth of content. You've got some cool little miniatures behind the DM screen, and your terrain is off in the corner sitting on another table. You've got a mat set out, and you've got all kinds of good bits. And you have notes and information on NPCs and the big bad villain, and the dice are ready to be rolled. And you have great descriptions of the places and the things that you want to take your PCs through. And somehow, somewhere, through either table talk or perhaps behind the scenes, in emails and text messages that you were not privy to, your group decided that they want to go somewhere else. So you give them the great description of the Gothic castle or the entrance to the dungeon, and they see the awesome reinforced iron door and blah, 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 and go, big description, and they say, we're going to go east because I thought I smelled pie, and I'm a halfling, and I want to eat. And you look at the table, and there's nothing there. You have nothing. What do you do? Here's some things to think about. As with all of my other suggestions, I am not telling you that this is the best way, the right way, or the only way. This is just my way, and perhaps if something here helps you just a little bit, then mission accomplished. So, there's 3 big things you want to think about and focus on, and these are things you can do sort of in prep time to help you become better prepared when you're not prepared. Does that make sense? Here's what you want to do. First, this is something that will help all of your Dungeon Master career. Build a visual library. So read everything. Read a lot of books, watch a lot of movies. Things like this should be relatively easy and straightforward, but also look outside the genre. So what do I mean by this? As a Dungeon Master, we've all seen The Labyrinth and The Goonies and The Dark Crystal, The Neverending Story, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, the MCU, Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff, DC Comics, right? We know the geeky culture, the pop culture stuff. But look outside the genre. So even though Fifth Element, as a sort of sci-fi movie, basically doesn't seem to apply to the grit of your dark fantasy, dark sunish world, use those things as your visual library. When you create a barren wasteland, or you have to on the fly because the PCs don't want to go to your dungeon. Instead, they want to go to the right, or they want to go east, and only thing out there on your map is barren wasteland. You can pull from maybe Dune. And just by having that visual library of either watching the movie, reading the book, knowing about it, you can start to say that there's these large reptilian worms, creatures. You can pull from Mad Max. And you can describe sort of just that Walking Dead, almost post-apocalyptic barren wasteland of nothing. Maybe they'll run into some nomadic tribes, which then can transition you into a sort of random encounter that makes sense for the area, but it's all unplanned. Because here's the goal, and I'll continue on in the tips in just a moment. The goal is to basically kill time. You have a session planned out. In my particular case, I play every 2 weeks, every Saturday evening from about 5 p.m. to midnight. So I have a 7-hour flow that I need to provide as entertaining and interesting of content as possible so that my players leave feeling like their night was worthwhile and they're going to want to come back. And when it's unplanned, you start to lose confidence because you're just not sure if everything is going to flow as well as it did in your head in the 2, 6, 10, 70 hours of prep time that you put in, because this is content I don't have. But as you build that confidence and you start to feel that even if the PCs go off the rails, number 1 is you lead yourself towards what I believe is a stronger flow for a campaign. In my world, my campaign, my setting is a canvas. I like to hand the brushes and the paints to my players and let them create the art. But by doing that, I leave myself vulnerable to them dictating the flow of things, and it may be at my cost in that I'm not prepared for it. Now, obviously, if you're using modules and pre-published content, it's going to have the choose your own adventure concept. If the PCs go left, read this. If the PCs go right, read this. But I'm talking about world building, your own creation, your own stories. Now, the other thing is if you are creating a world setting and you have everything to exhaustive detail. I've got the kingdom in the north and the south and the west. I have the cloud giant city up above. I've got the Underdark all plotted out and who lives there and what are the factions and all the different things moving around. Then you're fully prepared. But otherwise, you want to be able to have the freedom to let your players roam and not feel like you're railroading them, but still have the confidence that you feel good about what you're going to offer to them. And by doing that, the confidence translates into energy. And good energy at the table keeps good pace and good flow. And you can almost disguise it where the players almost feel like no matter where they go, you're ready. That's tip number 1. Build a good visual library. Tip number 2, have a cheat sheet of names. Now, I'm not talking about write a name and then have a whole paragraph of content underneath it. The point here is it's unplanned. But just a simple name. So what's in a name? I can simply have a list of dwarven names or Durgan. Now, instead of just Durgan, though, maybe write Durgan, King of Barenheim Peak. I don't know what the hell Barenheim Peak is. I don't even know if that's a place in my world. There's nothing on my map that says that. But by thinking of that and taking the name from a simple Durgan into Durgan, King of Barenheim Peak, I've now started asking some questions. What is Barenheim Peak? What is he the king of? Is he the king of all dwarves? Is he recognized by all dwarves? Is there another king in my world? And you don't want to prep this, but by mentioning his name in the game, it starts feeding that fuel cycle again, like I said, and just sort of, okay, he's a king. He's going to have a crown. What does the crown look like? I've got a visual library that I can describe. Is it a crown of looks like antlers and thorns from the leader in Lord of the Rings? Is it something else of a crown? Is it something from Warhammer, the fantasy game? Is it something from World of Warcraft? Is it Magni Bronzebeard sitting there in Ironforge? You get it. But I wouldn't think of a crown. I wouldn't think of the armor that he would wear or the guards that he would have among him unless I knew he was a king. But so by simply writing Durgan, King of Barenheim Peak, that gives you more. So write names like that. Don't just write names of people and NPCs. They're important, but also write names of places and things and locations and zones, if you will, in video game parlance. Just places overall. So you can just rattle off something and again, make it an interesting name. Make it something that's worthwhile. That's tip number 2, is have a good cheat sheet of names. I apologize. There are ferrets, and they are normally doing their own thing, leaving everything alone. And the minute I start recording, they go absolute batshit crazy bananas, scratch everything, chew everything, steal everything. So the next video will be about how to cage animal. I'm just kidding. Third one is you want to focus on senses. Okay, so for that, I'm talking about the 5, right? Sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. That's a good way to start combining it with your visual or the library that you have in your head to start to present the PCs with what would be considered like the read this to your players text box in a module. It gives so much more description, because what happens is if you go to the right and they approach a druid grove, and you're unplanned and you haven't thought about it and you have no pictures of it, you're going to sit there and for just a brief moment, there's that lack of energy and that lack of confidence because you're just not feeling you're just not feeling confident in your ability to explain this in such a grand way of it's a tree. But if you have the visual library of Treebeard and Lord of the Rings, and maybe some other druid groves you've seen as you wandered into the world of Dragon Age, the video game, or Mass Effect, as you approached a wilderness area, whatever. And you have that visual library, and then you start thinking of the 5, taste and smell. What do they smell? What can they feel? Do they actually feel the wind? As though there's like the spirits of druids wandering around. Look on your little cheat sheet. There's a druid here. And he's not just Ellengar. He's Ellengar, the Ancient Elder. Whatever that means. But now they're old druids because the Ancient Elder sort of informs and moves me towards the direction of something more than just a druid. And you can see where I'm going with this is you start to just sort of feed into this and take some moments. It's okay. You may have some veteran players at your table that understand even if you just outwardly said, give me a second, guys, let's take a break. Let's take a bathroom break, smoke break if you need it, get some food, snacks, whatever. I need to plan for this a little bit. This is unplanned. Let me kind of wrap my head around it. But now I can start kind of chewing through the ideas in my head, looking at the cheat sheet and my names, and start thinking about, okay, they're going to come upon some trees maybe. And I remember I saw just the other night this scene in Pandora where everything was kind of glowing in purples and lights, and I want them to go someplace like that. And I don't know what that is, but I've got a little name that says the Gloomwarden Grove or whatever. And I'm going to use that. And then I'm going to use my senses and say that it looks like this, and they can smell this, and they can feel this. And then ultimately what will happen is something will come in there, and you'll sit there and you'll think through any good piece of media, whether it's consuming content in a book or a comic book or an anime or a TV show or a movie, there's always some sort of villain. There's always some sort of conflict, something that moves a plot and a story forward, something for the PCs to overcome. So then consider that. That would be kind of the fourth tip, is try and get something towards an encounter of some sort. It doesn't necessarily have to be a roll initiative encounter. It could just be a social encounter or just overcoming some sort of obstacle. They meet a merchant that's real reluctant to sell them anything, but he maybe has some really cool magic items. And by doing that, especially if you take it into an initiative timing or a combat encounter, you tell them to roll initiative, and now everything turns into combat timing, which can take a good hour and a half at your table. And that's all you're really trying to do, is fill up that 7 hours or whatever your gameplay is, fill up that time so that you have something interesting and worthwhile, and get through the session and your players are, they applaud, and that was pretty good, man. I enjoyed that. And they feel confident that they're not throwing you off the rails and not derailing the campaign, that they can go anywhere. And you feel confident that if they do that, you've got something that you can give to them that's kind of cool. And then you can take that prep time in between the next session, take what they've learned in the new area and start to incorporate and weave things together. And it makes the world and story about them. And that's what you're trying to do, is just get through the session. Kind of, I made it. I made it through the day. I was not ready for that, but I made it through, and I'm ready to plan for the next one. And maybe they'll do it all again in the next session. But you start building on that base of confidence. And over time, you're never going to be as good when you're prepared, when you've got some things ahead of time. And again, you can always just over detail everything if you want to, and have just not just names, but sort of 4 or 5 sentences under every single name of something about it, like where they're from, what they want, what are their fears, what is this place like, what's the history of it, whatever. But hopefully these little tips have a good visual library, something in mind, different content that you've consumed that give you good description and things to run with. Always have a little cheat sheet of names, things like that. Use the senses and try and take it to moments of conflict or something like that that can chew away and eat up at like 2 hours of real gameplay time. Combining all that together hopefully should give you something you can take with you when your PCs go the opposite direction from what you had planned. That's all I've got, folks. Thank you for watching. See you later.